The music has done playing, which means I get to welcome you all back to another glorious month and treat you to the Precision Teaching Podcast with my awesome co-host, Doug Kostowitz. Say hello, Doug.
How you guys doing today? How's everybody? I hope everybody's doing great. I'm ready to go. We got a great show for you. Let's get it going.
Okay. Well, we have an email question today, Doug. And our email question is, Hi, Rick. Love the show and especially the interviews. I am learning a lot about precision teaching from you and Doug. My question is, has precision teaching ever been used with a normal graph? And that is from, that's from Barb in Santa Clara. Well, that's a good question, Barb. What do you think about that, Doug?
I was trying to think of a good quotation I could use there, but I can't think of one. Everything that I know about PT is that if you're going to do PT, the chart comes along for the ride.
Yeah.
So
right.
My guess is that you can do a lot of good things with kids, that if you're taking data and you're making decisions, but if you're doing PT, then it's integral to use the chart to make decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's the bottom line. If precision teaching is defined by its use of the standard acceleration chart, that's the main driver of how people make decisions. So you're really not doing precision teaching if you're not using the standard acceleration chart. It doesn't mean it's bad if you're using a linear graph, but there's, the power of what we get with the standard chart. You wouldn't have that. So technically, I don't think you could. I mean, you could certainly say that there are things about precision teaching which have developed, like using learning channels to describe behavior, right? You could use learning channels with anything, and that's part of PT, but I wouldn't say if you're describing behavior with learning channels, that's using precision teaching. You agree?
I agree. You can use aspects, and as you said, you can do good things, especially if you're taking data and making decisions, but you have to go the next step and use the chart for it to be precision teaching.
Yeah. So, Barb, I would say that's a really good question. So, to answer that, technically, you couldn't say you're doing precision teaching with a normal graph. And, that's the other thing, too. I guess when you're saying normal graph, you must mean linear graph, because there really is no normal graph. You want to use the graphic that's going to solve your problem. You want to use the graphic that's going to give you the most information. So when you're working with your kid, or if it's not a student you're working with, if it's something you're monitoring, you want to use the graphics that's going to give you the most information so that you can make a decision, or you can evaluate or analyze or interpret what that data is saying. And in that context, there really is no normal graph. There are just certain graphs or graphics or statistical, or visual graphics, or whatever we want to call them, that can best suit certain situations. And what we know is our standard acceleration chart is specially designed and well-suited to show human behavior for just a host of reasons, which I think one day, Doug, you and I are going to have to just have a whole show on the chart, in talking about, having a chart theme show, talking about the different aspects of it, and maybe looking at some data out there where people have looked at the chart.
Sounds good.
So that's a great question. It is it's a good question, and thanks for asking it. So, Doug, have you ever wanted to do a 1-minute rant?
Have I ever wanted to do a 1-minute rant? Well, I've wanted to do rants, but I don't know if I've ever allowed myself just 1 minute. But I think that perhaps we should add this to the show at different times, giving one of us a chance to do a 1 minute rant.
I like it. Everybody likes our rants. I know you can't see this, but I'm winking at you. That's you collectively, audience. We get fired up about stuff, but you don't want to hear us go on for the whole show ranting about something, although sometimes listening back to my other previous shows, I think I probably do that as a default position for some things because I really get I get fired up about stuff. I'm guilty as charged.
You're guilty as charged, and I can barely get a word in edgewise.
That's true. So we're going to add a new segment to our show where we call it the 1 minute rant. So
in honor of, finish the sentence. In honor of what? I was prompting you to finish the sentence.
What's it in honor of?
What's it in honor of?
In honor of me ranting?
No. Oh, my goodness. So when I brought this up to you, you didn't understand the value of 1 minute with precision teaching.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Well, they do have all these, I'm banging myself on the head right now. Like, okay, Rick, you got to see the obvious. They have all of these. I mean, this 1 minute rant is going to join the high, wonderful other 1 minute things like 1 minute abs. Who doesn't want 1 minute abs? And how about they have this book out there called like the 1 minute manager. Have you heard about that, Doug? It's a really famous book where people talk about using some behavioral technologies and using it for management purposes. So there's all these different kinds of 1 minute things. We do use some 1 minute timings in precision teaching. Again, okay, I know some of you people are out there saying, don't define precision teaching by 1 minute. I'm not. I'm just saying we use 1 minute. Hey, I might go on a 1 minute rant about that. But no, I have a 1 minute rant about something else.
You get 1 minute rant.
Thank you.
My goodness. I was just thinking, hey, we limit our chart share to 1 minute. Why not have a 1 minute rant? So I'm not defining precision teaching by 1 minute, but 1 minute does have a lot of history.
Yes, it does.
A lot of application in precision teaching. So I don't know how 1 minute rants will contribute, but it gives you a good chance to just say whatever the heck you want to say.
And you too. But rather than both of us rant for 1 minute, we're just going to switch it up every now and then. So 1 month we'll give you a topic that we're going to rant on. And this month, the 1 minute rant, and you can see this if you go to the webpage. If you're downloading this from iTunes, you won't be able to see it. But if you go to the webpage where Doug and I house our podcast, you can see the graphic. But the 1 minute rant is going to be on, there's a web banner that's been a number of different ones. There's just one on the website that have been on the ABAI website. For those of you who aren't familiar with ABAI, that stands for Association of Behavior. Wait a second. Yeah, Association for Behavior Analysis International. They could probably rant at me if I mess up their name, right?
You don't get a reverse rant. You don't get a
That's right. We control the airwaves.
So, okay, let's summarize. It's on the banner. It's on the website. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Are you going to time me?
I got you. Get ready. Go.
Okay. This, we hold graphs we use to communicate data. We hold graphs in high regard in science because of what they do. In fact, the history of graphical display is like a fabled love story, right? It's like The Princess Bride. It's this beautiful story. I want to know, what are you doing, ABAI? Am I supposed to like your take on artsying up these graphs? I mean, what if I came to your house and painted it pink with green and blue polka dots? Is my artistic take going to make your house beautiful? No, the beauty is in the design. And just because we're doing something artsy doesn't mean we give it an artistic interpretation. I mean, I may be giving you leeway too. I mean, who knows? This might not even be an artistic interpretation. Maybe someone who doesn't like science said, hey, I'm going to rile up those ABAers by desecrating their graphics.
Stop.
I got to finish. The symbol of what we hold most in dear is data, and it's displayed graphically. So if I can steal a line from ESPN, I would say to ABAI regarding those graphs in the web banner, come on, man. There we go.
All right.
That's my 1 minute and a few extra seconds rants about these graphics.
All right. Maybe we should include a response cost, so if you go over, you get less time to rant the next time.
Or I may just have to change my 1 minute rant to a 2 minute rant.
I guess you can just mess with the rules.
Why not?
I guess so. I don't know. All right. So then let's move on to the next one.
We have science news. Yes, science news, Douglas.
Science news. Nobody calls me Douglas.
Oh, sorry. I'm
Sorry.
Big D.
All right. So our science news for today is available on. Is it available on the iTunes site also?
No, I mean, any links that we put up, you have to go to our website to check it out.
This science news is entitled. It's a small article. It's called "Lies, Damn Lies, and Psychology Experiments."
Mm-hmm.
And I guess to summarize what the article's focus is the deception of subjects in psychology experiments. I don't know.
Yeah, it's using deception in research.
Right, and I don't know. When I was in undergrad, I was in the psychology department, and you hear stories about doing all different kinds of studies, and it's bringing people in, doing something, and then actually the study's on something totally else. So it's misleading the participants, lying to them, and then measuring something else, and then either maybe not even debriefing them, but there is a person here that's talking about this and saying, when you lie, you're bringing experimenter bias into the research, and I don't know. I want you to also share what you think about this, because I have a next step past this article that I want to bring in. So go ahead. Maybe it'll be a minor rant.
Well, picking up on what you're saying, in psychology, there is a long history of using deception in research. And in fact, when I was reading this, I could not help but think about probably the most famous, well, I don't know if it's the most famous, well, maybe it is the most famous experiment in psychology using deception. And what do you think that one is? If I said to you, Doug, what is the most famous experiment in psychology using deception, what would you say?
Is it the one where the person sat in the room and was giving pain to someone?
Yes, that's the Stanley Milgram study. Exactly. I knew you'd come up with this. So with that study, they were looking at obedience to authority figures, and they would say, hey, look, you got they start off and they let the person feel the shock, and it's like it tickles, and then each time the person says something wrong, the shock goes up higher, and eventually it gets to the point where it's like XXX could cause death, and like the person's like, you gotta like they gave him some kind of line where it's like, please continue with the experiment, and these people were delivering what they thought were fatal shocks to these people, or near fatal. And I mean, just think about it. I remember watching that when I was an undergrad in psychology, and then afterwards the people came out and they were almost crying. They're like, hey, I'm so sorry. But I mean, that's just crazy to think. I mean, you can't do that kind of research now, especially, imagine trying to get that through IRB.
I'm laughing because I couldn't imagine it.
Yeah. But this study, what they did is they had, here's the headline, and this is reported in Psychological Science. The headline was, people who wear discount mock designer sunglasses feel phony as a result, and they're more likely to cheat and judge others as unethical. So based on this experiment, that's what they took from their experiment. And in their experiment, what they did is they had these female participants, and half of them completed this bogus questionnaire, and they were told that their answers gave them a preference for counterfeit products. I mean, they just said that. And the other half, weren't told that lie. Then they were instructed to take these sunglasses from this box, and the box said counterfeit sunglasses. And, I guess the tricky part is these weren't counterfeit sunglasses. They were actually expensive designer sunglasses. So the people were told, wear these, walk outside the lab for 5 minutes. Then they also told them to work on lab tasks after that, and they were paid money for their correct responses. So what they did is they took these worksheets that they were filling out that were supposed to be anonymous, but they checked their responses anyways. And the results of the experiment was the people who were tricked, those participants said that they made more correct responses than they actually did. Also, these misled women would also describe others as more unethical or devious. So as what you said earlier, there's an alternative explanation to this. And that alternative explanation could be that the participants, may have made these inferences about ethics based on, their take of what was going on in this experiment. Maybe they judged that, hey, something shady going on there. So they could have been negatively influenced by this experiment, meaning the interpretation in what was reported could be wrong because of the way this was used. So I guess a take-home message is be very careful if you're using deception in science and deception in psychology. But you had some other thoughts beyond this article.
Yes, and that is we take pride in precision teaching and also behavior analysis of measuring behavior, measuring the object of measurement, then we in turn discuss or place that performance in the greater scheme of things. So we've got some performance, actual behavioral performance, but what you see in psychology is making these inferences to the next step. And when I originally got this title from you, that was my expectation, was that when you measure someone's perception, not necessarily their behavior in that moment, and then in turn make some greater inference past that individual, you're not being fair to the situation. But that comes from my experiences and my training in precision teaching and behavior analysis to look to that. So it's not that I'm on any individuals who take grandiose explanations for perceptions or some related construct that's been devised by someone. It's just the general theme of doing that. So it's not just I'm not going after individuals, but the general notion of going well past your data. We don't go past our data. We talk about our data, and what's there is there. And things got better, things got worse, things didn't change, things are variable, things are accelerating, things are decelerating, whatever those behaviors are, and then we talk about those in relation to what's going on in the environment and can make changes with regards to our education, we can make changes with regards to our intervention, whatever. But when you go past and try to make some grandiose statements of these that are probably based on weak representations of behavior, that's what I thought this was going to be about. So I just wanted to make sure I got that word in also.
Mm-hmm. Sage advice from our good friend Doug Kosowitz.
That was, what, 35, 40 seconds of ranting?
Nah. There's a difference between ranting and a difference and just discussing things that are you're passionate about.
I didn't use any ESPN bylines.
That's
I was
right.
cool like the other side of the pillow.
Right. So this science news, it's interesting. For those of you who listen to this podcast, you're probably interested in things like psychology, sociology, education, or some related field to that. And if you read news in psychology, you're going to come across experiments that use deception. Of course, you'll come across experiment. That's the other thing too. Making, as Doug's pointing out, you have to be very conservative, and when you go off and make these big claims, generalizations, that can be a problem because this gets out there, it hits the news, and then people start making these assumptions of human behavior. I mean, that's what psychology is, right? Psychology is the quest for understanding why do we as humans do the things that we do. And people who come from certain disciplines in psychology are trying to make sense of the world and trying to make sense of humans in nature. Why is it we do certain things? And this science news is a cautionary tale that sometimes, again, we need to be careful with interpretations of certain experiments, and especially those that might use deception. So there we have it. Science news to live by. Well, that brings us to our next section, and this is an article review. And the article that we're reviewing today, again, this is on our website if you'd like to download it, is called The Development of Numerical Estimation in Young Children. And this came about from a book that we're reading. And the book is called Here's Looking at Euclid. And this book is, by the way, it's a really cool book. Maybe we should do that one day, is start having like a segment for books, like book reviews. I'm sorry, I'm getting off task here. But
okay.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
But this book is looking at what's the relationship between math and the world. The language of science is math. And for those of you who are into math, you can see just not the complexity, but the beauty of math and the relationships between so many different things. It is, in precision teaching, we chart behavior, and although we're not doing these complicated statistics are being done when we chart our data and we look at it visually. So a lot of the math behind what we're observing and what that data is telling us is being done based on the construction of that graphical display. So, math in this book are really cool. And there's part of this book that they're talking about, how is it that we as humans, how do we visualize magnitudes? And they talk, this book was talking about this guy he's an anthropologist, and he went to, where the heck did he go? He went somewhere, and I should remember where he went, but he was working with people who never had math. So these would be people who, lived, I guess in the bush would be the way to say it. Maybe was it Africa? At any rate, he was talking about the person who was trying to get a sense of how these people, how was math involved in their lives, and how is it that people visualize magnitudes. And what this guy discovered was that these people that don't have math tend to visualize magnitudes logarithmically. In this article that we read today also looks at that, and it says, how do children develop numerical estimation? So when you estimate something, there's different ways you can estimate things. You can estimate quantities, right? So I have a bunch of marbles. You can estimate those marbles. You can estimate things like maybe money or measurements. But then again, if you measure those types of things, you need to know, what kind of money system is it? What kind of measurement system are you talking about? You can also measure, there's other things that you can measure that are going to require some kind of knowledge of whatever it is you're measuring. So if you were making estimations of how many people are there in Pittsburgh, where Doug lives, you'd have to have some type of knowledge about Pittsburgh. And then, of course, there are just other estimation tasks that don't require prior knowledge. So I could just show you something and say, how many of this do you think that there are? But this study looked at how do kids develop estimation. And this article gets into talking about different theories that people have held. What type of estimation do people have? So they talk about, what were the ones they said? They had, they talked about it being logarithmic, but didn't they say, was it a linear? There was logarithmic, there was linear. I think there was one other way that they talked about estimation, one other model. Maybe it was a combination of the two.
It was a mixture of logarithmic and linear.
Yeah. So what they did in this experiment, they did a couple experiments, and they looked at, to make a long story short, they looked at, they gave these kids, they had a number line, and what they would do is the number lines would be ranked from, like on one end it would be 0, and maybe the other end it would be 100. And they would say, okay, show me where 23 is. And the student on that number line, again, only 0 and 100 were there, would have to mark where they thought 0 or where they thought 23 was. And then they would look at how close do these students get to 23. And the results of the experiment, and they did another experiment, but again, to talk about what they found and what they concluded is they concluded that when kids are very young growing up, they have a logarithmic sense of estimation. And as kids get older and go through the grades, they tend to adopt a linear model of estimation. And this is a fascinating article for a number of reasons, and I invite all of you to read this. But again, how we look at the world and what type of functions are representing the world, that's pretty important because we're interested in nature. We're interested in how do we best represent phenomena in nature. And it's fascinating to see that these people that don't have math, they're estimating things, and their sense of magnitude is logarithmic. Kids, before they really get into lots of math, they're coming out with the same too, with the sense of looking at things logarithmically. So this is a fascinating study. What were some of the things that you took from it, Doug?
Well, just it makes sense. It's easy to see 2 is bigger than 1 and 5 is bigger than 1. But is 53 really that much bigger than 52?
Right.
And so when you're uneducated in why 53 is more than 52, you see 2 piles of things that look about the same, or the length looks about the same. It's the same thing. So they don't see that division of the 2. We have to teach that. But when you see 75 and 10, there's a noticeable difference, a logarithmic difference between those two. Now, there's a linear difference, but logarithmically speaking is what shows when you're thinking big things like big differences, that's the important difference.
Yeah. I mean, think about this.
So,
If I show you 5 dots, right?
mm-hmm.
And I show you 1 dot, that 5 dots is going to be 5 times bigger than the 1 dot, right?
Yep.
Now, what if I show you 10 dots? How much bigger are those 10 dots than those 5 dots?
Twice.
Exactly. So that's what we see when you're young. We think about these and we make these estimations in terms of logarithmically. It's only when we are in our math system and as we get older, this linear notion of the world is almost, it's got to be pounded in us, right? I mean,
Right.
think about our field and our science. It's so hard for people. People always say, why should we use that standard acceleration chart? I don't see any reason for using it. But thinking about behavior and thinking about it logarithmically versus thinking about it linearly, because we're stuck in the linear world, it's just hard for us to break free and to understand that a behavior that goes from 100 to 50, that has divided by 2. But that's what that looks like. But then again, the behavior going from 50 to 25 is a divide by 2. But from 100 to 50, that's a linear difference, or of 50, right? But the other difference is only 25. So you're like, whoa, wait a minute here. I like the difference from 100 to 50, but yet it's the same. Because when you think about it in terms of how much it's dividing by. So this article, it's a fascinating read because it, again, tells you a lot about estimation, and it also tells you about how this changes and how children are making sense of the world, at least in terms of math and estimating magnitudes.
You know, the best way, and I didn't even think of this until sitting right now. This is how I make money off my 3-year-old son. He has a $10 bill, but I go give him 3 pennies. That's 3 times as much stuff, so he likes that. So he does think logarithmically. But of course, I don't really do that. Please don't call my.
You know what I need
But,
to do? I need to come over next time it's Nicholas's birthday. I need to come over there and with his money, when your parents aren't around. I'll just he'll end up I'll leave and he'll have 85 cents and I'll go home with $100.
1,000 pennies.
Yeah, 1,000 pennies and I'll go home with all this money. No, I wouldn't do that to your
But
son.
it works on kids. They'd rather have 2 pennies than a quarter.
Right? Good point.
Because that's not just linear. Then you've got to teach the value of the coins. That's the whole thing. That's a real. I think that's a real solid practical example that I think every kid learned. Once you learn that the value of coins, you can definitely take advantage of little kids because they think more is better. And 2 quarters and 2 pennies, that doesn't sway anybody. But if they have 2 quarters and you have 10 pennies, 5 times as much, they're thinking, I got more.
Yeah. But as you point out, some of that requires knowledge of that measurement unit, and that measurement unit's money. So if they don't have that, then they're just looking at, here's 3 things and here's 1 thing. I want 3 things because it's more than the 1 thing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay.
Right.
Doug, that was a good article review discussion. Now, I would like to move on to our interview. We have another fantastic interview with Skip Berquam, and let's move on to the interview. Joining us today on the Precision Teaching Podcast is Skip Berquam. Skip is retired superintendent, and right now he's working as an interim superintendent. Skip, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rick. Pleasure to be here.
Skip, I always like to start off the podcast by getting a background of our guests and how they got into precision teaching.
All righty. My first principal's job was 1974 in small town Hardin, Montana. And about the second year I was there, I began reading and hearing about the Sacagawea project up in Great Falls. And that was my first knowledge of precision teaching, even though I had come from Western Illinois University and Nancy Johnson was there. And I visited with her a number of times the spring before I left. But I knew nothing about precision teaching or her work, but I've often thought back about what an opportunity I missed there to get to know somebody that was a pioneer there. Anyway, probably 75, I wrote a grant for our district and took a group of teachers up to Sacagawea, and that started what became a career-long hunt for the science of education and learning for me, and it's continued with me, although there are certainly times in my career when I've used precision teaching and fluency issues a whole lot more than I have at other times.
So you were a principal, and now did you receive formal training at a university on precision teaching?
I went through the training at in Great Falls when they were doing all of their training for districts all around the country. At that point, that project was really active in the mid '70s, and I stayed in Montana, and we had I was principal, but I was also the special ed teacher, so I got daily use of the things I had learned up in Great Falls. 1978, I left Montana and went to the University of Florida and worked with Bill Walking and Hank Pennypacker and ended up finishing a degree down there in special ed and psychology, and worked a lot with those two great folks.
Okay. And after you get your degree, you go back out to the West Coast?
I did. When I went down there, my intent was to be a college professor. And as I got to know Hank Pennypacker and Bill and a few others and talked with them about what careers were like, and they convinced me that since I already had some nice experience in public schools, I would potentially have more impact on kids in schools in the K-12 setting than I would in higher ed. And so when I graduated, actually before I graduated, I took a job. I'd finished all my classes, and I took a job in Orlando, which was the original Orange County Precision Teaching Project, and I ran that project for a year, which is where the international conferences started. And then when I finally graduated in 1981, I moved to Washington, was an elementary principal, and have kind of moved through at that point.
And when you worked as a principal, so you went back and then you worked as a principal at the once you had your doctorate. That's correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And here you are, freshly minted PhD. You're excited about precision teaching. What kind of impact did you have as a principal helping teachers, or like how did that impact you as a principal, and what could you do in the schools that you worked at?
Well, I came out with lots of energy and lots of enthusiasm, and probably more enthusiasm than wisdom, and almost got run out of town the first month I was there because our district was doing pre-kindergarten screening, and I was trying to convince them that they ought to measure inches per minute that the pre-kindergarten screeners were coloring between the lines or cutting on a dotted line, and they didn't think they didn't think that was probably the best thing they needed to do, and so I kind of got my ears pinned a few times and learned that we don't need to be a crusader on all this stuff, because if they're not ready for it, we got to take another step towards it. But I did that, and I was principal in an older elementary with a really experienced and senior staff and a very traditional staff, and within like a year of that time, the primary staff particularly had become pretty active in using what I would call fluency based stuff, and I know that probably that term bothers a few folks, but that's really what that was. I was always a guy that was looking at what we gained and what we learned from precision teaching, and as the most important part of that, and so that group of teachers really learned to use fluency building techniques a great deal in basic skills.
What were some of the examples that you could recall that your teachers were doing in their basic skills and the types of fluency interventions they were running?
Well, many of them were using daily practice, and some of them were using timed practice. And when I started building a rationale with them for the kinds of fluency goals that we have for basic math facts, or oral reading rates, or words in isolation, and they began to see, with me coming into their classrooms and starting that with kids and doing that with kids, and they saw that what originally they thought were unreasonably high rates were really quite achievable by most kids if they get some practice and some appropriate teaching and motivation there. And they began using that essentially with the entire class. We had 3 sections of each grade level. So we had 10 teachers at the primary level that were using fluency building techniques almost every day in math and reading.
Wow. With your logistically, how does that work? Did you do cross-age grouping, or does the teacher primarily work just in the classroom alone and does the grouping within the class?
Yes, we did very little changing between classes. So at the kindergarten and elementary level, or first grade level, the teachers did a lot of the work until the kids got comfortable with how they were, able to pair up and do some of the practices and timings, and but it really did kind of become ingrained in that group after a period of years, and it stayed that way. I was there for 4 years, and they continued using that stuff for 6 and 7 and 8 years afterward, till some of those people started to retire.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I have a similar experience when people. I suppose that's one way I'm having many thoughts as you say that. So let me just cut back and ask you this question. How did that impact the certain high stakes assessments that are taken? Did you see an effect on maybe before you came and the teacher started doing this, and maybe you take the Iowa tests, or I'm not sure what you were using, but would you see an effect on those types of high stakes testing? We did have, and it takes a number of years to build that up. And when Washington started to go to their first statewide high stakes testing, it was called Washington Assessment of Student Learning. It was grade 4, 8, and 10 at first. And sorry, that's my other phone ringing. No problem.
And when we got into a couple of years of the WASL tests, and I was no longer at that district, and after a while I wasn't. I was across state, but I downloaded the entire state test result piece, and in terms of, and the scores I was looking at was the percentage of kids that met the standard. And so there was like 1,100 elementary schools in the state at the time, and I downloaded and created a database with those scores in math and reading, and along with the building's free and reduced lunch percentage, and then did a correlation of those things, which to nobody's surprise was quite high. It was like minus 0.73 or 0.74 for reading and math at the fourth grade level, and then taking that and using that as a projection of what the correlation would do, looking at a district's free and reduced lunch and where they should have been unless something was changing it. And what that gave me was a look in it, and it was a different score. If a district did better than expected, they were in the positive, and if they did lower than what they were expecting, it was a negative score. And that district was that school where I was in the top 3% of districts in the state in terms of the number of percentage points above prediction. So they were like in the top 30 schools in the state in beating the prediction, which to me tells me they changed what the factor was that had the highest correlation of anything that we've known on predicting achievement. And some of that's changed now, and I no longer do that, but I did that for 3 or 4 years with the entire database, and that school district and that school continued to do quite well until folks started to retire and leave the district.
That is remarkable. But it's also in line with what we find out with what a lot of people do with precision teaching. So that's very good to hear.
Well, we know it works really well with individual kids, and it's really hard for anybody, I think, to argue with that. But from a public educator standpoint and an administrator standpoint, they want to be able to see that with groups and with whole schools and with whole grades. That was a school district where, in that particular building, we had probably 65 to 80 kids per grade level. So, I mean, that was not a small school in that district, and the groups did quite well, and I was really proud of that. And I was gone from there by the time I did that, but the people that were continuing there were still there.
With such remarkable success, do any neighboring districts peek over and say, "Hey, what are you doing?"
No, because nobody knew that kind of technique that I was using. I presented that at a few conferences and sent that to our state education department, the graphs of that, because it creates kind of a nice graph, because you get a prediction line, and what's interesting about that is that a building could be below the line of prediction, but might actually have a higher percentage of kids passing than a lower income school that was above the line. And it really, to my perception, it leveled the playing field in terms of prediction, and some of the most affluent schools in the state didn't do very well, and some of them were below what that correlation would have predicted, and then some of the schools like Jefferson, they may only have had 50% of the kids passing, but the prediction was 35% passing, so they were hugely successful in terms of changing the impact on those kids.
From a principal's perspective, and from what you've seen, how much effort does it take to get the teachers up and running? And I guess that would include not just learning what to do, but also having materials to actually do it. Precision teaching, that is.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I had a couple of things. One is, having just come out of that Orange County project in Orlando, most of that project was designed to develop probe sheets and fluency building sheets, and so I had a wealth of that. I also had a spreadsheet that generated word lists and phrase lists, and so I was able to produce customized word lists and randomized word lists for almost anything that a teacher wanted. So I had materials that they could use, and my standard way of doing that was, after visiting with them, seeing if, what kind of interest they had, and I would ask them if they would like me to come in and do it with their kids, so they could see how that was going. And typically, I would do that and kind of do an awareness session with the whole class, first grader, second grader, didn't matter, and kind of build a rationale with them about what it means for somebody to be really good at something, and the things we're going to try to do today are going to help you get better at. I might have started in math, or I might have started in with oral reading or word lists, but getting them started and giving them enough of a background so that they could get better almost every day when they started. And if those kids were doing that, they would not let the teacher put it away and not do it. The kids kept it going, and then the teacher saw the motivation there, and some of the kids, and what we told the kids and what we told the teachers, doesn't matter where you start, get better every day. And then we recognized the kids that got better, and that got lots of kids recognition who wouldn't have normally gotten recognition in there, and then get them into some of the management pieces where the kids are charting and doing a lot of that work, and so it doesn't take a long period of time. But I found that to be the most useful piece in promoting that, is getting the kids excited about it. Even some of what would normally be reluctant learners, they get some success, then the teachers are seeing that immediately.
So it sounds like, and I'm always puzzled at this because I don't know what the answer is, but maybe you have a personal thought. What is it that, what can we do to, you shared how this could be started, and even to some level how this starts getting momentum, but I'm always interested in what maintains this, because I've been in places where you have your, let's call them change resistors, and they're not, no matter what you present to them, they're not likely to embrace it. So what are some of the variables that you see that would help maintain precision teaching interventions in classrooms?
Well, there's got to be enough support from either from the principal or bringing some teachers in, visiting with them, brainstorming when kids flatline a little bit, how to make some changes and how to make instructional decisions based on that is a real key. And depending on how the days go, and sometimes it's relatively easy for a principal to do that. Sometimes it's not particularly easy because that can take an awful lot of time. And I don't know, and that was a district of 5,000 students at the time, and there was some use by other buildings in the district. I also happened to be director of the reading program after I left my job as a principal, and so we had a lot of our title teachers using the materials and the procedures, but it's when the champion and the person that's really supporting and promoting, when that kind of momentum leaves a building or a district, it starts to go. If people don't have if they don't have colleagues and things that they can continue to share, and even when kids are doing better, it'll start to be, well, I won't do it today, and I mean it's a pretty intense 5 or 10 minutes, as anybody that's done that knows, and It's just it's one of those things. I guess we have human nature there, and I wish I knew better what keeps people going in those things. I had developed a pretty good sense of how to get people started, and what not to do to get them started, because I had that beat into me a couple of times. Um, but when I was no longer there supporting, and maybe there wasn't enough inertia in terms of staff, it gets pretty tough to keep that going. And I don't know. Well, that's been a long time ago. I'm sure all of those teachers now have been retired. But I would guess that probably 10 years after that period, even though there were still some teachers there, it keeps changing. They change how they do it, and without constant support and discussions and how are we doing, it gets hard to keep it pure.
In your tenure helping these teachers and observing student behaviors, what were some of the innovations that teachers did that may have surprised you?
Ha. Well, that's an interesting question. Boy, you're taking me back about 20 years or 25 years here in memory, Rick. Uh, people were always looking for a different or simpler way to chart. I mean, I think I'm pretty understanding of the issues and the debates that go around that. I mean, that's a gatekeeper issue for people getting into precision teaching, and folks were looking for different ways to do that they could understand better. And I'm not sure that I was always maybe the best one to keep that measurement pure, but they were finding ways to recognize kids. That was a high poverty school. Mm-hmm. They were finding ways to recognize kids for growth that they weren't able to do before. And so we had kids who were, they were learning basic skills that they hadn't done before. And I would, if I had a dream job to do going into an elementary school, I would offer to go in and be the basic skills teacher and the basic skills consultant. Let somebody else do the gifted and talented and all the wonderful higher level thinking skills. And my dream job would be to try to send them every kid that can read, write, and calculate. And if they can do that, then I would be convinced that the other teachers can get them to do what they need to be successful in the upper grades and in the higher level issues. But I'm convinced that we're probably still in a stage where teaching basic skills is kind of unattractive, and there's not much magic in that, and it's real easy to put that on the back burner, and as a system we still don't do that very well, and I think there's still huge growth that we could make there, and I'm glad there are people in precision teaching who are working on something else besides basic skills. Mm-hmm. But basic skills is still an incredibly vibrant and needy field in all of K-12. And I mean, we got millions of kids in schools that they're not getting that exposure.
I agree. I'm in higher education, so that means I swim in the pool with some pretty interesting fish. And there are professors that, they're on record saying this, not in my particular program in special ed, but in places like curriculum instruction, and they'll actually denigrate practice of basic skills. And I could never understand in any human activity, anything, playing sports, playing music, you name it, if you don't master the fundamentals, you're going to have a hell of a time moving forward. And I just can never understand that mindset. I agree with you,
and I know, and I have experienced resentment and disparagement from people in higher ed that don't believe in what we're doing, and the classic overused phrase drill and kill.
Yes.
And my response to that is, come watch me do this in a classroom with low-income kids who are not very well skilled, and you come in every day for 5 days, and at the end of that 5 days, you tell me the kids who have been pushed down, who have poor self-esteem, and are worse, and are trying to get out of doing this, rather than coming to me and say, Dr. B, will you help me do this? Because it won't happen when those kids experience some growth and improvement. That is the highest motivator we could ever get any of them to have, and that's just it's a huge piece. And when we do that correctly, the kids will flock to it, rather than somebody's sense that, oh, we're gonna depress all these kids by making them drill, and that's nonsense.
Yeah, I don't even use that word drill anymore, and I'll always correct people who, well, when I can correct them, like my students, when they say drill, I'll say just call it practice, because practice is natural. Practice is something that, parents take their kids to soccer, to football, to band. Practice is something we aspire to.
Yes, and I started using the term fluency building many years ago, and teaching what that means, and kids began to understand that, and kids used that. And what's interesting in doing those kinds of awareness presentations, kids will often get that more than some teachers will, and more than some higher ed teachers will. Parents will get it quicker. Parapros will get it quicker than some people who have gone through, some training and have learned that we don't need to do that stuff anymore. What we really want is to be able to have kids understanding the answers. And so it's been kind of a frustrating piece. And there was a couple of years when I was supervising some master's level teacher education candidates here in Spokane, and I would do an awareness session with this stuff, and like most of the things, maybe half of them would be pretty interested, and a third might not be at all, or might be offended by it. But one of the questions that somebody invariably asked is, if this is so good, why haven't I heard of it? Mm-hmm. They've gone through methods classes, they've gone through all this stuff, teaching reading, teaching methods for teaching math. They've never come across the term or the concept or the notion of fluency building, and the issue of dealing with basic skills is, it's just almost a foreign area for them. And I think that's a real disaster for our teacher education.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, you, at some point in your career, you make the move from principal to superintendent. When you make that move and now you're working as a superintendent, how does your job change? And can you still, as a superintendent, do you still, in that role, have the ability to push or help inculcate precision teaching?
Yeah, you can, and some of that depends on the size of the district and how close you are. My first superintendent's job was in a district of 600, so we had a single elementary school, and my office was in the elementary wing. So I could walk one door down and be in a first grade classroom, and so I could still visit with the teachers and do those things as a superintendent. But in the larger districts, you get so far removed from the instructional level that and working individual with teachers. It's impossible to do that in a larger district.
Mm-hmm. Right now, you're working. Well, let's just keep with when you were. I guess you are right now full time as a superintendent. What do you see as the big initiatives in schools now, and where does precision teaching fit in?
Well, that's an interesting question because I'm probably not the most current guy. I was retired for 3 years and out of everything except doing some. There's the dog bark. Doing some search work for districts, and so I've been out of that for 3 years. The last time I did a district as superintendent. It took me about 5 days, and I was in a classroom doing oral reading with kids, and the teacher they were thrilled to have the superintendent come in and do some of those things. The testing the testing in Washington has changed. We had a long history of dedication and support for some other kind of test besides multiple choice, and the state's scores kind of leveled off after a while, and the amount of time and effort it took to do all those things became more and more intense and time demanding. But one of the good things, even though we've now abandoned that test, the WASL as we call it, we've now got a different one that has some multiple choice and it's quicker and easier to do. One of the things that we don't have much argument with anymore is testing is bad. We really don't need to do very much. We're doing too much testing. It's bad for kids. Back in 1978, when I first came out to Washington, we had counselors and some principals who would, when it came time for testing, their message to kids, thinking that they were trying to help them not feel defeated over taking tests. Their message to kids was, this isn't real important and it might get frustrating, so don't worry about it. And that's a hugely different message than telling kids some of this is going to be real difficult, but give it the best chance you can and work hard at it, and we'll get better at it the next time we do that. And that's a real different message. And over about a 4 or 5 year period, in the mid 80s, the debate in Washington, at least, about are we going to test and are we going to have all these test scores was over, because we were going to test and we were going to have all these test scores. And so at least it took away some of that debate and at least somebody's validity in telling their class that, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal.
Mm-hmm. I wondered about the big move. The big move right now seems to be response to intervention, and it seems that precision teaching, in terms of people saying, hey, what would be an in for precision teaching, in response to intervention seems one area in schools where precision teaching might have a resurgence, so to speak.
Yeah, I would think so, and that was just coming in when I left the field actively, and I don't have a lot of background in what how that's being implemented and what the implications are, but mm-hmm. But I can't imagine that there would be very many programs that could show, when properly done with kids, that could show the impact on learning, therefore response to some intervention that precision teaching and direct instruction would have. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's real direct. Granted, we got to have people buying into the notion of frequency-based measurement to really make the point with our stuff rather than somebody else's. And if we don't win that argument, I don't think the rest of them make much sense.
Well, Skip, we are towards the end of our interview. Is there or are there any questions I should have asked you, or any topics you wanted to talk about that we haven't brought up?
Well, it's a broad field, and I'm continually reminded about how bright the people are. I still read most of the listserv stuff that comes across my computer. I don't respond to very many of them, but I'm impressed with how bright people are. I'm impressed with the heart that they have, and all of these behaviorists, that people that don't understand what behaviorism really means, who really do care about people and care about kids far more than some of the other fields would ever give us credit for it. And I'm continually impressed by that. I'm also impressed by the depth of the discussions and how the field has changed and become more technical. I have a hard time now following Owen's discussions on the list about charting issues, and because I've been away from that, and so that part of it has grown and continued to develop, and I think people ought to be really proud of that. I think we still have some really basic issues because occasionally there will be quite some extended discussion on the list about why isn't K-12 adopting our stuff. Mm-hmm. I've responded to some of that. It's part of it is approach, and part of it is that there isn't a body of research that is easily findable for school administrators to show the effectiveness of it. And if we look back at the Sacagawea project in Great Falls in the 1970s, I mean, they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of charts showing how effective it was with kids. They also had very significant change data on achievement tests that they gave. And I mean, we can denigrate those. We can say, well, there's a whole lot more to it than that. There certainly is, but that's the kind of data we've got to have, and you got to have broad application to do that. And we've had huge success in a fairly narrow and very deep relationship with individual kids and individual programs, and I think if we're ever going to get broader than that, we may have to accept that some of that's going to be more shallow. Mm-hmm. But if it's a mile wide rather than a yard wide, where we're having impact on thousands of kids in a school district, that will sell precision teaching, and the notion of fluency and rate-based stuff that has come out of precision teaching far better than anything else. And we don't have that yet. Mm-hmm. There just aren't many. It started with Great Falls had it, and then when Ray left there, and Dick Clement and the principal and the teaching staff, and that program kind of dissolved. It'd be interesting to go back there now and see how many people are still using anything related to it. I suspect there is some, but we've got to have whole school and whole district applications, and that will get, if not the educators' attention, it will get parents' attention, it will get advocates' attention, and charter schools may be a better option in those cases than the public, because it's easier to implement some of that stuff.
That was an inspired answer. I'm going to have to cut that out and play it to my students next time I'm talking. Well, on behalf of the audience, I would like to thank you for taking time today and speaking with us. So, Skip, thank you, and I hope I have the opportunity to speak with you again.
I would look forward to that, and I appreciate the work that you're doing to further the field, Rick. You're doing a great job, as the people all are around the country that staying involved with it, and I'm proud to have been a part of it.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Well, as I said, Doug, and I say this every time, that was a heck of an interview. You're supposed to agree with me.
I do agree with you. I'm having a little technical difficulty, so I'm not always hearing what you're saying.
Oh, well, that's a problem.
Yeah, well, it's something we'll work out over time, I'm sure.
Well, we've moved announcements to the end of the show. The one announcement we have is that the Precision Teaching Conference is going down this week in November, the following week, the first week in November. If you're hearing this and this is the first time, grab a ticket, fly out to Seattle, meet the best and brightest of precision teaching, minus Doug and me, and have a great time. Any announcements from you, Doug?
No.
Okay. Then.
I can't think of anything that's worth announcing at the moment.
All right. Well, on behalf of Doug Kosowitz, I'm Rick Cabina, and I thank you for listening to the Precision Teaching Podcast.